So we'll start by talking about radioecology, the evolution of it. Let's see, did Dr. Kato send out an announcement that had some connections to YouTube videos? Did you see those? Some of you did and some of you didn't. If you didn't get that, I encourage you to get them from Dr. Kato. They're short 5-10 minute videos. Oops, we have technical difficulties. They're short 10-minute videos on basic concepts in ecology. The difference between individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. Can collectively we kind of go through that? Arigatou gozaimasu. So, what's the difference between individual and population of animals? Can someone help me here? So a population would be a collection of individuals. So you could have a single wild boar, but many wild boar would be a population of boars. You know this stuff, surely. This is basic ecological concepts. Then what would be a community? The next higher level up. A community would be a population, many populations. So populations of wild boar, a population of woodpeckers, a population of trees, many different components make up a community. The next level is ecosystem. What's the difference between a community with all these different populations and an ecosystem? The ecosystem includes the biotic and abiotic components. So biotic is living, abiotic is non-living. So an ecosystem includes all those communities of living things, but also the minerals, the water, the non-living component, all together make up an ecosystem. So this is a science of radioecology. You would think that we are studying radiation in the ecological systems, and one part of that is what is the effect on individuals, populations, communities, and ecosystems. So those links that I sent to you, they're really nice little short YouTube videos that kind of describe what I just talked about in a much nicer way. All right, let's get started here. Let's see, we'll do it this way. So just recently, last year in Miami, the International Union of Radioecology, they met in Miami and they said, we need a consensus. We need to get together and decide how we're going to protect the environment. And they had some summary statements, and this is one of their summary statements. Successful protection of the environment depends on the protection of natural populations, so that's that word that I just used there, their dynamics, species interactions, so that implies a community, because you have to have several populations in a community, and contributions to ecosystem function. Ecosystem approaches are needed to support these protection goals. How can I get that off of there? Oh, there we go. Then, just a few months ago, the International Union of Radioecologists met again, but this time they met with the Association of Ecosystem Research Centers. The meeting was held at the Savannah River Ecology Lab, and the objective was to discuss the challenges of integrating ecosystem ecology into radioecology and risk assessment. So here this International Union of Radioecologists is meeting with ecologists saying, let's get ecology back into the system. Well, because of our word, radioecology, maybe you think, why isn't it already there? Why are we now having to meet with the ecological sciences to get a connection between radioecology and ecology? So this lecture is about how we had ecology early in the 1950s and 60s, but with time, radioecology has lost that component. And now we're trying to get it back. So I'm going to give you a history of how radioecology was formed, and then how we lost some of these ecological components. How are we doing with the volume here and the speed of my delivery? Are you understanding most of this? The English is okay? Okay. So the International Council of Radiological Protection, they have a Committee 5, and they have recently come up with a way to do risk assessments for environments that have been contaminated with radiation. And they use what they call reference organism approach. They call them RAPs. And RAPs means reference animals and plants. So they have developed 12 standardized organisms. And those are on the border of the slide there. There's a standard duck, a standard fish, a standard tree. And they can calculate the dose to these standard organisms. And from that, they determine the risk to the environment. The dose rates are calculated using very simple models and concentration ratios. And risk to the environment is based on individual level endpoints. Here again, it's individual, population, community, ecosystem. This methodology by the ICRP looks at endpoints at the individual level, and that's really important. And you might question, why are they looking at the individual level when we're actually trying to protect ecosystems? There's a disconnect there. So this is some work by Claire Bradshaw, just published a couple of years ago. She's referring to this ICRP approach. She says it's simple and it's convenient for risk assessment, and it may be okay, but it does not include a lot of things. It doesn't include ecological interactions. There are many things that are happening in ecosystems that are not linear. It doesn't look at those. And it doesn't guarantee protection of the entire environment, because this approach just looks at 12 different model organisms. So on the far left there, you see the reference organism approach. They are looking at individual organism endpoints like early morbidity, mortality of individuals, reproductive success of individual, and maybe chromosome damage in individuals. All these are related to individuals, but radioecology is trying to protect, or so they say, populations and communities. So there's a mismatch between what they're measuring and what they're trying to protect. If you're going to protect these things, you need to be looking at these parameters, such as population growth rate, the density of animals or plants, the size, all these different parameters. Structural, biodiversity, that's the number of species within a community and how they're distributed. And functional components, energy flow and mineralization. So Bradshaw and many people in the International Union of Radioecologists are claiming that what we measure to protect the environment isn't really a good indicator of what we're trying to determine, population and community effects. Okay, so now let's go back 50 years, 1965, and let's look at the state of radioecology 50 years ago. And I'll do that by looking at the volume 11 of Health Physics that was published in 1965 and show you just the titles of several articles that were published in this single issue. And it will give you a sense of the type of studies that were being done in radioecology 50 years ago. So the first one, effect of gamma radiation on possums, gray fox, raccoons, and bobcats. That's what we do in Fukushima now, same kind of studies. Factors influencing the accumulation of fallout in deer in Colorado. Radiation in animal populations, problems, progress, and projections. Here, populations. That's that important word that we're going to be coming back to. In the abstract of this one, they talk about the importance of measuring the functional efficiency of irradiated populations and evaluating the performance of populations. These are things 50 years ago that the ICRP, their approach using RAPS, is not using at all. This is a very advanced method. The ICRP method is very simple, and yet this was 50 years ago. Here's another one. Effects of radiation on natality, that's birth rate, density, breeding structure. Structure, oh, that's a good word. That's a good, solid ecological word. On populations of lizards. Radiation damage to forests surrounding an unshielded fast reactor. I think many people at this department are studying radiation and forest cycling, cesium in forest. It was done 50 years ago, in part. Here's another one. Still the same issue, a single issue in health physics. Trophic level effect of cesium concentrations. So trophic level effects means effects from the consumer to the predator. So this is a community level examination. Interactions of gamma radiation and other environmental stressors. This is a mixed contaminant study. COMET is a consortium in Europe whose one of their primary purposes is to look at mixed contaminants. And here 50 years ago, they were already doing that. Radiation effects on plant populations and communities. Mineral cycling, that's all the way up at the ecosystem level. So in this one volume, here's the last issue, feedback between radiation ecology and general ecology. This article was written by Eugene Odom. If you take an ecology class in this university, I guarantee you that name will come up. He is considered the father of ecology in the United States. So a very, very influential person. 1965, 50 years ago, they were doing radioecology at all levels of biological organization, from populations, communities, ecosystems. But yet, just last month, we had a meeting of trying to get this all back together. Where did we lose it? This is in the history of our science. So, how did radioecology form? Let me give you a little history here. After Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, or AEC, continued to develop nuclear weapons. And then Russia became involved. They tested their first weapon in 1949. From 1945 to 1980, there were more than 500 atmospheric tests around the world. Many countries got involved in this weapons production nonsense. The Atomic Energy Commissions had a factory perspective of radioecology, of radiation safety. To produce these weapons was an industrial process. There were huge factories that were separating uranium from 235 from 238. There was huge reactors. It was just a tremendously large-scale process that was involved to produce these weapons, industrial process. And radiation safety at that time dealt with the protection of the individual worker. It would not be too different from a factory today where workers are going in, maybe they're producing asbestos or something, and they have to wear masks, and there's the whole safety program is protecting the worker. That's how radiation safety was dealt with in the 1940s and 50s during the production of these weapons. So, in the early 40s and 50s, the AEC scientists had a remarkable knowledge of nuclear physics and chemistry. I mean, the knowledge required to mine uranium from the soil, separate it out from all its components, separate 235, develop fission or fission reactions within a weapon. That was incredible knowledge for that period of time, and took a great deal of skill in physics and chemistry. However, as knowledgeable as they were, there was a remarkable lack of knowledge about the environment in the 1940s and 50s. So this is some of the views that they had in the early 1950s. They believed that exposure from external gamma radiation was the key risk from fallout. They did not consider internal contamination. It was all external. The majority of the fallout would be contained within the boundaries of the test site. So they were testing weapons, for example, in Nevada, the state of Nevada in the western United States. They believed that when the weapon went off, most of the fallout would come right down. We now know that's a bit different, but in the 40s and 50s, because of their ignorance of environmental processes, lack of knowledge of environmental processes, this was what governed radiation safety. Internal exposure from environmental food chains was not important. That was their philosophy then. That was the state of the knowledge. So, for example, they knew that iodine 131 could contribute to thyroid problems, but they only considered it up to this point. They didn't know that iodine could be taken up by cattle, transferred to the milk, drank by humans, and concentrated in the thyroid. The internal pathways were not considered. It was external exposure of the iodine that was the main component of their safety programs. This is Dr. Libby. He was a commissioner, or one of the managers of the Atomic Energy Commission. He felt strongly that the weapons that were being tested, the fallout would go way up here into the stratosphere. So this is troposphere, this is Mount Everest, here's where planes are flying, spy planes, stratosphere. He said that the fallout would go up into the stratosphere and it would stay there for 10 to 12 years. So it wouldn't be a problem to the planet because all the radiation was going so high up into the sky, and it would get trapped in the stratosphere. This shows the height of one of the tests called Bravo, and in just 6 minutes the fallout, the radiation was 40 kilometers high. So it indeed went that high up into the stratosphere, but his hypothesis that it would stay there for 10 to 12 years was not true. Dr. Libby turned out to be a very famous person. He received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1960 for developing the carbon-14 dating. So this was a very knowledgeable individual, but his knowledge of atmospheric processes and environmental processes in the 40s and 50s was not the same as the knowledge that we have today. Here's an example that shows that radiation does not stay in the stratosphere for a long period of time. This is becquerels per kilogram. It's a log scale, 0.5, 5, and 50. This is iodine in the thyroids of Colorado deer and elk. This is the detection limit. This is time periods in months, 1964 and 1965, from Wicker and Schultz. So they would go out and they would take deer and they would look for iodine 131 in the thyroids of them, and they noticed that there was these big spikes. Recall that iodine has a physical half-life of only 8 days. And they correlated these big spikes with above-ground tests occurring in various countries, so including China and Nevada. So what this means is, here's the test in China, and in just a few days, or a week to 10 days, already the iodine 131 has gone up in the stratosphere in China, circled the globe, is now over the United States, and is being deposited in the mountains of Colorado, falling on the plants. The deer eats the plant. The thyroid, the iodine goes to the thyroid very quickly. If it was if the radiation was staying up in the stratosphere for 10 to 20 years, you would not see this phenomenon at all. So the radioecologists began to quickly see the importance of environmental factors and how these environmental factors could influence the movement of radionuclides in the environment. Here's another example of the primitive state of our knowledge of radioecology. This is in 1951, Merrill Eisenbud. He was an industrial hygienist for the Atomic Energy Company. He worked in the state of New York. New York is in the far northeastern United States. And one day, Kodak, who you all know, a representative from Kodak, called Dr. Eisenbud and he said, "What's going on? There's radiation in the environment. It's exposing our film. It's ruined all the film in our factory. What's the cause? What's going on here?" And Merrill Eisenbud, who was a very knowledgeable physicist, suspected that the U.S. had tested a weapon in Nevada, in the far western part. So he called the medical director at the Nevada test site, and he said, "We've got radiation out here in New York. Did you have a test?" And the director said, "You're crazy, Merrill. I was just out at ground zero where we had the test, and there's no radiation out there. And you're telling me it's all the way up in New York? No way. You're crazy." So then Merrill called Washington, D.C., and he said, "Check your monitoring stations and tell us where the radiation is going." And the AEC said, "We only checked 200 miles out. It can't be any further than that." So their belief at that time was that even though they're testing weapons, the fallout is going to be very close in, less than 200 miles. There's no need to even monitor beyond 200 miles. Well, here's a reconstruction of one of the early tests. This was a reconstruction done in 1997. This is the state of New York. This is the Nevada test site where the U.S. tested several weapons. This test was done on April 25th, 1953. These are the dates, April 26th, 27th, 28th, and these are the paths of the fallout as reconstructed by models and the knowledge that we have now. And these are at different altitudes, 10,000 feet altitude up to 40,000 feet. And you can see that the rate of transport across the United States varies depending on the altitude, and at 40,000 foot, it does indeed cross the state of New York, and that's why Kodak was having trouble with their radiation, with their film manufacturing. So the assumption that all fallout would stay within 200 miles of this site was very naive and very, very wrong. But 1940, 1950, our knowledge was not so good about environmental processes. So this type of phenomenon educated us. We learned a great deal about movement of atmospheric transport processes. So the AEC view of fallout in the environment, not understanding the complex ways, caused the AEC to drastically underestimate its risk. But this underestimation was not just the AEC. There was a general public global lack of appreciation for environment. There wasn't an environmental movement in the 40s and 50s. The environment was someplace to dump your waste. We didn't appreciate the environment in the 40s and 50s, or most people didn't. Then, in 1954, the U.S. tested a weapon called Bravo. It was on the Bikini Atoll. The Bikini is, well, you all know where the Bikini Atoll is, out Hawaii, Guam area. So this is the Bikini Atoll, and they tested many, many weapons there. On this particular one, March 1954, it was a huge weapon, 1,000 times greater than the Hiroshima and Nagasaki weapons. They grossly underestimated the yield on this weapon, so it was much, much larger than they anticipated, and it resulted in widespread contamination of the marine resources. It also contaminated these two atolls, Rongelap and Rangirik, and the people that were living on these had to be evacuated. And to this day, people are not allowed to live on these atolls. The contamination was so great. There was extensive fallout, and this caused a worldwide outcry against weapons testing. For the first time, the public was really made aware of some of the consequences of all these weapons being tested. And it forced the Atomic Energy Commission to more thoroughly assess the radiation impacts of its weapons program. This Bravo test contaminated a Japanese fishing fleet boat called the Lucky Dragon. I suspect that most of you are aware of this. It heavily contaminated the boat such that one member of the crew died from radiation poisoning. The contamination was so widespread throughout the Pacific that it contaminated a large percentage of the tuna fleet. Tuna harvest, sorry. This is a picture in the Tokyo Tsukiji? Tsukiji. Arigatou gozaimasu. Fish market in 1954. They're measuring radiation in the tuna catch. The United States ended up paying Japan a lot of money because they contaminated the tuna harvest. So, historians of ecology now state that fallout became the first global environmental crisis. The publics of many, many, many countries were aware of fallout from nuclear weapons, and they were aligning and criticizing these weapons programs. The fallout enabled scientists, environmental scientists, to have a voice, to say, this is our science, look, as we understand it, this is what is happening. And this enhanced the credibility of environmental scientists for the first time. Before, environmental scientists was kind of a soft science. It doesn't compare to physics and chemistry. But now, these experts realize we have to understand something about the environment if we're going to understand how radiation is dispersed. In fact, here's Nature's Economy, a book written by Donald Woester. He says the age of ecology, not radioecology, but the broad discipline of ecology, began outside of New Mexico in 1945 when they started testing weapons with a dazzling fireball of light and swelling mushroom cloud in radioactive gas. So this author is saying ecology actually started due to weapons testing programs. 1957, U.S. Congress held special hearings about fallout, and they said we need to have the scientists to come forth with a satisfactory explanation of the radiation problems. In 1957, the Atomic Energy Commission created a special environmental studies branch to deal specifically with oceanographic, meteorological, and ecological aspects of radiation. Back in 1957, Congress is looking at ecological aspects of radiation. 1958, they hired an ecologist who became the director of this environmental branch. And the first thing he did is said, I want you to do large-scale field-based experiments in radioecology. Get out of the laboratory. Go outside. Tell me what's going on in the environment. So, from 1950 to 1965 was the golden age of radioecology because there was a lot of money. The AEC was funding us. Lots and lots of money. All of you could be rich in radioecology if you were doing studies from 50 to 65. And it's because the state of our knowledge was so bad. We were mispredicting everything. We needed to understand the environment. We needed to understand how radiation moves through the environment. In fact, a very famous book by Rachel Carson, if you haven't ever read this, you should, Silent Spring. This is a book about pesticides in the environment. The very first few pages are about strontium contamination from weapons fallout. She used strontium contamination as a lead-in to her entire book on pesticides. So many of the scientific and social elements that make up environmental movements in the 60s were due to nuclear fallout. Very prominent ecologist in the 1956 who became interested in radioecology was Auerbach. He ended up being the leader of the Oak Ridge Ecology Laboratory. And this Eugene Odom that I mentioned earlier, that's him right there as a young man. He became very, very interested in radioecology, but more so just general ecology, and wrote many, many books. Radiation provided the ecologists with many exotic tools for their research. For the first time, they could track the movement of animals and estimate population densities. This is Odom's study done in the early 50s. They are taking P32, a radioactive source, and they're putting it on leaves of individual plants. And then they catch insects. And if that insect contains P32, they know it had to eat that plant. If it doesn't contain P32, that insect's not eating that plant. And by the activity levels in the various insects, they could say, not only does this insect eat this plant, but this spider is eating this insect that ate this plant. So preliminary food chains and food webs were due to studies of radiation in the environment. Other early studies were effects of stress on organisms, carbon-14 dating, radiosensitivities of species, food webs, and a means of quantifying the rate of material and energy flow through ecosystems. So the Atomic Energy Commission knew that these two brothers, Eugene Odom that I mentioned and his brother, Howard, were very knowledgeable in ecology. And they sent these two brothers to Eniwetok. This is another atoll close to Bikini, and asked them to study the dynamics of radionuclides on these atolls in the Pacific Oceans. And these two brothers saw the value of radiation, these contaminated environments, from an ecological perspective, and they knew they could trace things, use radiation as a tracer. So they, we okay? Okay. They were able to study these coral reefs and to quantify accumulations and transfers among ecosystem components. Everyone had been wanting to do this, but all of a sudden now there was a tool that allowed them to do it. So they did this in a very large way. They were able to even come up with a new term called mutualism, where the coral and the algae in the coral have this symbiotic relationship, and they were able to quantify that relationship with radioactive tracers. So according to this author, A. Brown, he says that systems ecology emerged from the field of radiation ecology in the Pacific Islands. Systems ecology is what we're striving for in many of our works now. Odom and his brother received the George Mercer Award. This is one of the highest awards in ecology at that time, in 1956 for their work on Inuitak Atoll. Eugene Odom was a man of vision. He went to the first Atoms for Peace conference in Geneva, and he stressed the importance of understanding the effects of radiation on higher levels of biological organizations, populations, communities, and ecosystems. The same thing that we just had a meeting on in October, and yet here in 1955, this gentleman was already saying that this is what needs to be done. He hinted at the importance of biogeochemical cycles and laid out the scientific basis for developing an ecology program, the Savannah River Ecology Site, and studied the effects of radiation on trophic structures, metabolic properties of ecosystems, and emphasized the comparison of contaminated and non-contaminated areas. He said you have to have control sites. Just don't go study the radiation. You need to study the control sites to make comparisons. Some of our studies now that are published in prestigious journals do not use control sites. This was state-of-the-art functional ecology with a new variable, radioactivity. Odom said the atomic age can well provide the means of solving the very problems it creates. The use of radioactive tracers in the environment offers an unlimited opportunity. He published this book in ecology. It's been translated into numerous different languages. You might study it here if you take a course in ecology. The second edition in 1959 devoted an entire chapter to radioecology. So, radioecology emerged as a science when the environment was recognized as a factor in human exposure to fallout radiation. Radioecology, transport and fate of radionuclides, effects of ionizing radiation on all these different levels of biological organization, and the use of radio tracers to understand chemical, physical, biological processes. This is what excited the ecologists so much. And that's why they were so busy in publishing in 1965 in the Journal of Health Physics. So, what happened in the 50 years? If we were that advanced 50 years ago, where are we today? And why is the Union of Radioecology meeting with the general field of ecology trying to bring ecology back in? So in 1963, fortunately, there was a ban on atmospheric testing signed by Kennedy. So atmospheric contamination stopped. By the late 60s, interest and funding for large-scale field research significantly decreased. That golden age of funding had stopped. In 1974, the Atomic Energy Commission changed its name as well as its goals to the Energy Research and Development Administration. And then in 1977, they changed their name and goals again to the Department of Energy. And with each change, radioecology got shuffled further down into the basement with less and less money allocated to it. Safety concerns limit the use of radioactive tracers. As I understand it, in this university, you cannot order radioactive tracers to use in your laboratories. Can you imagine ordering radioactive tracers and say, I'm going to put them out in the environment? Can't do that anymore. But yet, what an incredibly powerful tool it is when you can do that, and you do it on a quantitative basis. So all these things brought a stop to this rapid progress that radioecology was making. Funding agencies did not see a need for environmental effects research because the long-standing paradigm was, if you protect humans, plants and animals are automatically protected. Here's the International Council of Radiological Protection, the IAEA. If man is adequately protected, then so is the environment. Explicit radiological limits are not needed for the biota. If dose limits are set to protect humans, then the environment is automatically protected as well. So as a radioecologist, if I want to go study the effects of radiation on wild boar, and I go to a funding agency, they're going to say, you don't need to do that. As long as we protect man, we know that the wild boar is protected. So this philosophy that the international radiation organizations took limited our funding availabilities in radioecology. If we protect humans and all other things are protected as well, there was some rationale to that. This is acute lethal dose in grays, and these are various levels of organisms from viruses to humans. So you can see that viruses and the primitive type organisms are very radio resistant. It takes a higher dose to cause lethality. The most sensitive organisms are mammals. And among all mammals, the most sensitive mammal is human. So, in some regards, if we protect these, then everything else is protected as well. That was the philosophy. That's why I don't need any money, they say, to go study radioecology. The environment was recognized only as a pathway to human exposure. Effects to the environment were not considered. They're not important. Protect humans. The Commission concerns itself with mankind's environment only with regard to the transfer of radionuclides through the environment, since this directly affects the radiological protection of man. This was in 1991. That's not so long ago. Some of you were born by then. So as early as 1991, this international radiological group is saying, you don't have to study environment, just protect man. So, no other contaminant, leads, mercuries, pesticides, have been managed from such a strong anthropocentric perspective, meaning human perspective. What if we said, you don't have to study pesticides in the environment as long as you protect humans? What if you don't have to study endocrine disruptors in the environment as long as you protect humans? That's not the case with these other contaminants, but it is with radiation. So that makes radiation unique as an environmental contaminant, unlike all other pollutants on the Earth. Funding agencies prioritized other types of science. They viewed our knowledge of radioecology as being sufficient. Major funding cuts occurred. Radioecology became very applied, with an emphasis on transport fate model development. Well, if you're not going to give me any money to go outside and study radionuclides in the environment, at least I can sit here at my desk and make computer models and I'll become a modeler. That's where radioecology became. Also, radioecology became separated from the broader discipline of ecology. The ecologists were no longer interested in us because we couldn't give them tracers to study as a tool, because we couldn't get permission to use the tracers in the environment. So really, there are very few true ecologists left in this discipline that we call radioecology. The Chernobyl accident of '86 revived radioecology in Europe, but had little effect in the U.S. And it wasn't until 2005 that the ICRP formed Committee 5 to develop an environmental protection system. ICRP was originally founded in 1928. It took 75 years for them to consider the environment. And they did that just 10 years ago. All of these things are the reason that radioecology has lost the ecological aspects of it, and that's why we just recently had meetings with true ecologists, and we asked, how can we bring your knowledge back into our science? Eugene Odom. Okay, that was lecture 1. Thank you very much. Now we need to summarize it, and then we'll have a break. So help me. What have you learned, if anything, from this? Speak up, please. Well, I have to ask my wife in the back. This is the first time my wife has attended any of my lectures.
I don't want to answer this question.
And she hasn't fallen asleep yet. I'm impressed. Okay, so, true or false? Radioecology is as strong today as it was in 1960. True or false? How many believe that's true? How many believe it's false? Hey! Let's see. ICRP Committee 5. They're concerned with protection of humans. True or false? True? False. Oh, that was a trick question. They're concerned with protection of humans. All ICRP committees are. But right now, they're concerned with developing a way of doing environmental risk analysis. So they're concerned with the environment. I would give those who said false extra credit. But you didn't raise your hand, so nobody got credit on that one. Dang. I'm keeping score. Let's see. What other question here? Let's see. The ICRP approach using RAPS, is that a individual-based approach or population-based approach? ICRP Committee 5, is it an individual-based approach or population-based approach? Who says population-based? Who says individual-based? Yay! Even my wife raised her hand on that one. Okay. Questions from you? Can we take a break?
Yes.
What time would 10 minutes? What do you suggest?